Ladies and gents, welcome back. Now, only a few weeks ago, we had the largest protest in Canadian history where truckers trucked all the way down from the farthest regions of Canadian territories to Ottawa to protest against federal mandates put in place by the federal government having to do with COVID-19. Now, this protest, if you were paying attention to the mainstream media, they had a narrative that spun it in a different way. However, on the internet, we found lots of live streamers that were protesting or were showing the protest live at the time. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of footage of this protest taking place. Now, the Trudeau government declared a state of emergency over this, and in turn, what they did was they invoked the Emergencies Act and suspended civil liberties. Now, this is an interesting exchange that we had with Dane Lloyd at the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. MP Dane Lloyd asks officials from the Justice Department if they needed the Emergencies Act to suspend charter rights on search and seizures without a court order. The response: you are correct.
My next question for Ms. Maislin. Nobody's really been asking you too many questions today, but I'm wondering, under Section 63 of the Criminal Code, there's provisions against unlawful assemblies. My question is, was the assembly in Ottawa illegal before the invocation of the Emergencies Act? You're muted.
Thank you very much for the question. So as I indicated in my previous answer, there were indeed laws on the book. The question became whether they were effective in dealing with the situation as it evolved and to the point that it got to when the declaration was issued.
I just want to cut in here and interject and say she didn't answer the question he was asking. So like this is the most frustrating part about the lawmakers in Canada is they ask a specific direct question, but the response is not what was to a question that was asked. So what he asked was the protest deemed to be illegal at the time? And she didn't answer that question.
Was the protest in Ottawa illegal before the Emergencies Act was invoked?
I wasn't on the ground and wasn't aware of any charges being issued at that point in time.
So you would say it wasn't illegal until when the Emergencies Act came in place, then it became illegal, correct?
No, sir, that's not what I said. I said okay. I wasn't aware of any charges being issued. Whether or not the activities were illegal, it was determined that it was not a peaceful protest and had gone beyond what we would normally consider to be a lawful assembly.
So the Justice Department didn't know before the 15th of February whether this was an illegal or legal protest?
So I wouldn't be at liberty to disclose the legal advice that was provided to the government in the context of the unfolding situation. There were laws on the book. It was understood that the activities that were taking place went beyond what would be considered lawful assembly, but I wouldn't be able to go beyond that.
Before the invocation of the Emergencies Act on Monday, what would be the process to seize the bank accounts of Canadians?
I think one of your colleagues alluded to it. It would be a court process by which that would happen. And again, the sense would be whether the laws were available, whether they would be effective to address the situation that has arose is the determination that was made.
And why do we need courts to determine whether or not bank accounts can be frozen by the government?
Because we have to be charter compliant, and that is one mechanism by which we ensure that compliance.
So that's Section 8 of the Charter, correct? Unreasonable search and seizure?
Amongst others, yes.
So what you're saying is the Emergencies Act was necessary in order to suspend charter rights under Section 8 against unreasonable search and seizure.
So I appreciate that, and you are correct. The Emergencies Act does explicitly make reference to compliance with the Charter, and while we do benefit in Canada from very important Charter protections, none of them are absolute and are indeed subject to reasonable limitations.
But before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, you're saying you couldn't have seized people's bank accounts without a court order. But the Emergencies Act allowed the government to suspend that provision of the Charter, suspend charter rights in order to seize people's bank accounts?
So the measures that were put in place were targeted measures to address the situation that had been evolving and led to the declaration. And while there are charter protections, reasonable limits can be put on those rights in order to effectively deal with a situation.
And would that also carry over to Section 2C, which is the right for peaceful assembly? If we know whether this was an illegal protest or not, you haven't said clearly either way. But I mean, was the Emergencies Act necessary to suspend Section 2C of the Charter to allow law enforcement to break up a protest?
So we do know that the matters are before the court. There is a number of litigation that has been launched. The assessment was that what had been taken place was no longer a peaceful assembly, and there were specific criteria, very targeted criteria set out to identify what activities would indeed be captured by the emergency measures regulation that was put in place, specifically the serious disruption of the movement of persons or good or the serious interference with trade.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So essentially what's being said
there
is
for Ms.
nothing,
Maislin,
pardon me, nothing that they did had actually broken the laws in a place where they would be able to do anything. They wanted to take the protest down. They wanted to put an end to the protest, but the argument would be from the protesters would be, well, just meet with the protesters and see what their demands are. That was never attempted, but what was attempted was to suspend charter rights and specifically unreasonable search and seizure. Now, we would all probably agree that it's unreasonable to freeze the assets of Canadian citizens for daring to speak out against the government. But that is, in fact, what was done here. So they used the Emergencies Act to target specific citizens and make it so they couldn't purchase anything, wouldn't be able to use their own bank accounts to purchase food or fuel or anything like that. They were also trying to take away their trucks or any other property using the Emergencies Act. Most people would agree that the Emergencies Act was not put into legislation. It wasn't put into law to squash protesters. It was put into law for other extraordinary circumstances such as war or big natural disasters, stuff like that. Now, this was a protest that was protesting mandates put in place by the federal government that were itself extrajudicial and arguably unlawful, and this is why the protest was happening. There was no referendum on putting these mandates in place themselves, so there was no democratic process in which the mandates were put into place. So really interesting exchange, really telling on where the government and the Justice Department stand when in regards to our charter rights. Anyway, wanted to show you guys that, and as always, keep on trucking.